as if I wanted people with low attention spans watching me anyway. So, just to make sure that we're clear, and to ward off anyone else who has a short attention span, today we're going to be talking about a game that is very near and dear indeed to my heart. It references a lot of the other types of media that I enjoy, references plenty of books, video games, that sort of thing, and I think the game is becoming more relevant as of lately because of some other media properties that are coming to light. And this game is Shadowrun. Now, this game that I'm holding here, this book, this is a copy of Shadowrun's 3rd edition, which was pretty late in. There's sort of different eras of Shadowrun, if that makes any sense. So, 1st edition, 2nd edition, and 3rd edition are all part of the sort of original Shadowrun system. All of the games are pretty similar through the whole series, but 1st edition, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 1 to 3, these are all effectively cross-compatible. And this is very important because Shadowrun 1st edition especially has some of the best adventures that I've ever seen for any tabletop RPG, period. There, just coming to mind right now, is an adventure that is called the Renraku Arcology Shutdown, which is amazing to read on its own as a piece of creative fiction, and also amazing to play. And it has such an incredible depth to it. I think it's been referenced in other YouTube videos very similar to mine, actually, so I'm not going to go too far in depth with it. But needless to say, Shadowrun 1st edition has some of the best cyberpunky kind of sci-fi adventure paths or modules, whatever you want to call them, ever for tabletop RPGs. And you're really doing yourself a disservice if you don't check it out in at least one of the Shadowrun games. So 1st through 3rd edition, like I was saying, are cross-compatible. You can play adventures from one and the others. You can use equipment from one in the other games as well. Now, things were changed over time. The games were rebalanced, so you might need to modify things very slightly as a dungeon master, but most things pretty much can just be converted directly across with very little issue. Kind of like if you were converting something from basic to a game where you were also playing with champions and immortals or something like that. If you're familiar with the old versions of BECMI D&D, and or if you were converting something from BECMI to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, it can pretty much go across with very few scrapes. Though from basic to immortals would be a lot easier than BECMI to AD&D. So, my preferred edition, obviously, is going to be 3rd edition. It's the final edition that came out in the first wave of the Shadowrun games. After this, there was a 4th edition which came out, which made some changes, which included things like wireless matrix. And I'll get into what the matrix is in a moment. It's not exactly like it is in the movie. I'll explain that in a second, but there's basically Wi-Fi now in 4th edition, because it was made at a later date when that sort of technology was becoming ubiquitous. I think it actually came out in the 2000s, so Wi-Fi was pretty much in at that point. And then there is Shadowrun 5th edition, which I actually quite like. It's pretty much a streamlined version of Shadowrun 3rd edition. There's a lot of reasons why streamlined is a problem in this context. If it wasn't in any other game, which it always is, streamlining Shadowrun is kind of a disservice. However, because it has so much of the essential DNA of the original Shadowrun games, I'm not so offended by it. And it has a couple of really good rules on its own. I distinctly remember that the first time that I played it, there is a rule where if you get shot and you're wearing body armor, the armor will like bounce into you, like how like a plate vest, the armored plate will bounce into you if you're shot by a high caliber weapon, and it will stun you, and it'll deal stun damage. Really, really cool idea. There's a couple ideas like that in Shadowrun 5 that are fantastic, but overall, it's the best out of the new Shadowrun versions, but I don't think that it really holds a candle to the first 3. You should check it out, though. If you really can't get anyone to play Shadowrun 3rd edition, you should get people to check out Shadowrun 5. And then there is now Shadowrun 6, which has come out. Shadowrun 6 The World, I think it's called, and it's really, really bad. I want to make a video about it, but I read through the book with one of my friends who's also a gigantic Shadowrun fan, and I was actually like physically not feeling well for 4 days after that, because Shadowrun's my favorite game, or at least one of my favorite games, and I can't believe what they did with it. It's unacceptable. So I wouldn't so much look at Sixth World, the newest version of Shadowrun, as being representative of the Shadowrun games. If you've seen it and you didn't like it, I highly recommend that you go back and you check out something like 3rd edition, or failing that, 2nd edition, 1st edition were also extremely popular. So what is Shadowrun? Shadowrun is a cyberpunk sort of game that came out. It was actually competing with the game called Cyberpunk. The 1st edition of Shadowrun, the 1st edition of Cyberpunk came out within a year of each other, actually. So it's very inspired by things like Neuromancer, if you've read it, like William Gibson style cyberpunk novels. Neuromancer is actually one of my favorite novels, so it's a perfect fit for me. So what separates it from other kinds of cyberpunk futuristic games is that Shadowrun is also a fantasy game. So if you see on this front cover here, there's this guy. He's a troll. And I believe this guy down here is a dwarf. And then you have this person who I believe is supposed to be a human, but they look like a magic user of some kind. Actually, now that I think about it, they have a keyboard on their back. So they're probably a decker or something like that. But needless to say, there is magic in the game as well. So what's basically happened in the world of Shadowrun, it is actually quite well developed, especially in this core rulebook here, is that there's a dystopian future wherein world governments have been so pushed out by like multinational corporations that corporations have gained more than personhood. They've effectively gained statehood. They've been given extrajudicial powers by the governments that still exist to operate on their own land as if it were like separate countries. And these companies all are engaged in a sort of war with each other, kind of like something out of Deus Ex almost, but with even less government power. Everything is sort of this mess of corporate espionage as these different corporations try and edge each other out. This is a really interesting setting because a while after this, or maybe it was before, I can't quite remember. I'm pretty sure it happened after these mega corporations kind of took over. There is a magical awakening on the planet as well. Dragons take back to the skies again, and they're the most powerful things ever. One eventually actually becomes the president. There's what's called Goblinization, which is a process wherein people become like the fantasy races of old. So you're always born as a human, but over your life you will mutate into an elf or a dwarf or into a troll or something like that. There's other more rare races, but those are the main player races, as well as unaltered humans. The interesting part is that humans are also augmenting themselves. So not only can you be an elf and become like more dexterous and more beautiful, but you can also start hacking off your limbs and having them be replaced with cybernetic implants that increase like your speed or agility. I believe that you can even get things as crazy as like you can get a fiber optic cable through your hand that plugs into your smart linked gun. So now you can see like a targeting reticle that's barrel sighted for your gun, and that's really, really cool. And you can shoot people as if it was like a first-person shooter game, and it lets you roll extra dice to hit. And just ridiculous stuff like that. There's a pheromone, what's it called? Not receptor. There is a pheromone receptor as well that can increase your sense of smell, or you can smell people's fear essentially at that point. But there's one that's you put implants in yourself that end up releasing pheromones, so that way you can manipulate other people through their biology essentially. It's really quite interesting. So there's augments for all kinds of stuff. You can hold your breath longer. You can have a liver that makes it impossible for you to get drunk, which I bet someone like James Bond would really want to have, because he's drinking his martinis at the while he's like playing card games or whatever, and he has to be always sober and alert, ready to get into a gunfight. So what ends up happening is, because there's these corporations and they're kind of warring between each other, and there's so many people with so many different abilities, crews show up where these people are called Shadowrunners, and they're going on these corporate espionage actions between companies or between governments or something, and very secret, deniable operations. Their employers always go by names like Mr. Johnson. Normally they're called Johnsons, actually. So a Johnson will hire you regardless of who they are. That's the alias that they'll use. And you will go on some sort of really crazy denied ops mission to go get the briefcase, and they won't tell you what's in it, or to go into like a nuclear site or something and smash and grab some kind of like experimental core, and you have to get it to a truck and stuff like that. Very exciting game. A million different ways that you can play it. If you thought that you could play D&D in a bunch of different ways, like linear and kind of a sandboxy setting and everything in between, Shadowrun has even more options than that. Eventually, stuff started getting really crazy. You can go to space. It's insane, and the world is extremely well detailed because there's a whole like timeline of events that show up in all of the Shadowrun source books as well, up until 3rd edition, where you can see what's happened at different times on Earth, to base your game around these events, or to tell the players what kind of news has happened while they've been on a job, because news media actually exists in the game as well, kind of similar to how it does in our reality. People would have televisions, people would have internet access, and they would hear about these things as well. So, because I think this has kind of become a more obscure game than it ought to be, I thought that I would tell a story about how I got some of my friends involved with Shadowrun, and how it kind of became their favorite game as well. So I was looking for people to play Shadowrun with. I got my copy of Shadowrun 3rd edition. I think I was just using a PDF at the time, because I didn't want to mess up like an old screwed up book that I have. But I've gotten this one now more recently. The game's been out of print for a long time, and I believe it's actually changed companies. This one here was printed by WK Games and FanPro. I think that Catalyst owns it right now, or maybe Faza Corp. Something like that. Because they're even having licensing disagreements between their own games, which were made by like Harebrained Scheme, the more recent ones, like Shadowrun Returns, Shadowrun. I think there's a Hong Kong expansion for that, and the actual company that makes the Shadowrun rule books now are different. But Shadowrun, at least the version that I have, was WK Games and FanPro. And I really wanted to play the game with somebody because it's so interesting. So I went to work. I set up an adventure wherein it would sort of teach everybody the core mechanics of the game. I'm not actually sure if there are starter dungeons for Shadowrun in the same way that there are starter dungeons for Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, whatever you like to play. And this is kind of a problem because as I started talking about the rule book, Shadowrun is probably the best role-playing system with the worst laid out possible rulebook. Like, I'd probably give the rules like a 9 or a 10 for Shadowrun 3, and I'd probably give the layout of the rulebook a 2. But I imagine for 1st edition or something, there probably were adventures for that were made for low-level players to introduce into the mechanics. I couldn't really find any for Shadowrun 3, because I never really played any kind of starter campaigns. But I set up the situation where a Johnson was going to hire my friends. They were going to be in a sort of crew that had a handler above them. If you've ever played the Payday games, kind of like Bane, where he's like talking in your ear, he sets up jobs for you, but he doesn't go into the building or anything with you. Because I find that if the Dungeon Master has a player in the party, that kind of makes everything really awkward. If it's just a temporary thing, that's fine. But if he's like an established part of it, you should have the players play, and then you play as everyone else, kind of, I think. But so this handler got a Johnson calling, and the Johnson wants one hard drive out of a data storage facility. This data storage facility is this like gigantic structure. It kind of looks like the World Trade Center, the first version of the World Trade Center, where there's 2 towers, and they're, unlike the World Trade Center, there's connecting structures across, wherein people can walk across these like glass walkways, and it's supposed to look like really impressive, kind of like, a retro future version of Google, but with this kind of similar aesthetic, right? Everything's kind of minimalist. There's lots of like use of white and stuff, but they still have like those weird blue carpets and stuff from the 90s, because the technology of Shadowrun 3 is both more advanced and less advanced than what we have in our reality right now. So my friends are going to get hired. They're going to go and find this hard drive. And these guys all were Pathfinder players at the time. I think that one of them had played Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and like Labyrinth Lord and stuff. Don't quote me on that. But he played online for those kinds of games. But they were all Pathfinder players, like fantasy role players, and they wanted to try something new, so I think this was perfect. And so their handler tells them what the job is. They go, they find some kind of way to get to the building, drive in with a van or whatever, unmarked van, get out, go into the building. If you've played Shadowrun before, you're probably wondering, why didn't they ask additional questions? And that comes up later. So the characters that they rolled into the building as were, one of them decided to be sort of like there's not really defined classes in Shadowrun. There's obviously defined races, but those don't really count as classes. Those just are based on attribute scores, kind of. So this one guy wanted to be sort of a face character, like the leader of this, what would you call it? Like again, I'll use another example from Payday because I think people will understand it, but there's like a leader class in that, where you talk for the party, you yell at people to get on the ground, you give those kind of like, nobody be a hero and nobody gets hurt kind of speeches. He wanted to be like that, so he built this character such. You do kind of a modified point buy system where you place weighting on like, do I want more money or do I want more ability score points or whatever. So he built this character so that they weren't really a very good shot, but they could talk their way out of a paper bag. Very, very smart, good at like immediately walking in and just casing an entire room. So they were perfect for this sort of hit leader kind of role. Another one wanted to be a drone rigger. So a rigger is somebody who either drives vehicles or pilots drones. So they can be someone who flies a helicopter. They can be somebody who uses like a little surveillance thing. In the military, people who fly like a Predator drone or whatever for the U.S. Army or U.S. Air Force, I suppose it would be an example of actually a real-life rigger that's fairly accurate to how a drone rigger would be in Shadowrun. So he wanted to be a drone rigger, and he actually made his drone somewhat like something out of Watch Dogs. If you've ever played Watch Dogs 2, where it has the drones in it, where it has a bunch of like little wheels on it and arms as well. So it's like almost like a Mars rover that can perform like fine motor skills from a distance. So you have that and that. So you have the face, and you have this drone rigger. And then the third character was a street samurai. If you've read Neuromancer, you'll know what sort of a street samurai is, where they're kind of like a Ronin wandering knight of the cyberpunk future, and they'll just kind of take jobs. Generally, they're sort of an enforcer class where they're perfectly intelligent, but or at least some of the time they're perfectly intelligent. They have very good skills with weapons, to say the very least. They're exceptionally competent with firearms or melee weapons, whatever they feel is going to suit them for the job that they're on. So we have a street samurai, we have the face, and we have the rigger. They go into this building, and it's at this point that they ask, where is the hard drive? But they're already inside of the building, and people are kind of staring at them. So now they can't case the place with the drone or start walking around in the garden and get chased off by security before going in. They're already in the building. So they try to start this sort of hit on the structure, just sort of ragtag. Like everyone whips out their guns. At this point, the security in the building is noted. They're notified, rather. Alarms are going off. People are cowering under desks, and the face goes up, and he grabs somebody, and he's yelling at them like, "Where's like the main data storage location, where's like all the hard drive racks, pretty much, because it is sort of a technology level that is how people in the 80s and 90s imagine how the future was going to be. So this stuff isn't all like decentralized to cloud locations. It's all in the building. There's not really any backups. There's just a bunch of racks of hard drives. And so they find out that there's, I think, 4 different like big cages full of hard drive racks around the building. And they end up running up some stairs, going across the glass bridge, and into like an office space where there's like a break room and there's some cubicles. And they get everybody down on the ground in that location. And they start to finally scout with the drone that the rigger has. And because they have hostages, the PMCs that are guarding this data storage facility can't really do anything without employees being killed. So they're trying to call higher and see what's allowed. The drone rigger's going around, and they're trying to call their handler like, oh shit, which hard drive is it? Johnson doesn't know, the handler doesn't know, and they didn't really scout the place at all. So they, the rigger drives his drone down some stairs, eventually finds this place with all of the hard drives in it, sticks the drone in, and starts to sift through files. I can't exactly remember how he was doing it. Maybe a player went down with the drone. They started to like look through, because they knew the file name, or at least like the type of file that it was going to be. I think it was like video recording. So they started like looking through, which they weren't supposed to be doing, but they had to figure out which one is supposed to be theirs. And no, it's not on this bank, or at least they can't immediately find it. So they start going to the other ones. At the same time, one of the elevators dings on the floor that the face and the rigger who's like looking through his drone are now on. And this is sort of a problem, because the mercenaries that you can hire or that exist in Shadowrun are totally badass. And also, there isn't, I mean, there might be, so I shouldn't be saying that there isn't, but it's not really a requirement to have a monster manual or a bestiary or anything to play Shadowrun. You actually sort of create characters that are very much like the player characters, because there isn't really a linear leveling system, and there isn't really assigned classes. You kind of have to make your own guys. So I'd spent, I think, 100,000 Nuyen are the credits of Shadowrun, making these corporate security guys that are all wearing like super cool armor with like the smoked visors, and they've got blue stripes and stuff on them. And in Shadowrun, pretty much anyone can kill anyone. The idea of, if you play like 5th edition or Pathfinder or something, getting knocked down just to death at first level by a first level type enemy that you run into, like a goblin or what have you, that's sort of out of the question, almost. But you can be killed remarkably quickly in Shadowrun at pretty much any level, because it's based on a D6 system, 6-sided dice, where you roll a number of successes, and the other player is going to roll against you and is going to try to soak up or dodge as much damage as they can. But getting hit is a problem, and oftentimes if somebody is very skilled, that they put a lot of points into using a certain weapon, they can roll so many dice that they just kill you. And the elevator dings, and the 2 players that are on the floor, maybe it was 3, are like, oh shit, guys are coming up. And the face is in this, the middle of this big speech about how he is going to, he's trying to do kind of what the terrorists, like the Nakatomi building in Die Hard, are doing, where he's trying to like divert the expectations of security if they go and interview any of these people, if they have to leave the room or something like that. So he's saying this is like some kind of big plot from some terrorist organization that they'd heard about on the news, and they want this to free some kind of political prisoner. Elevator dings. 2 security guys walk out. They've got submachine guns, something like that, and they've just got ridiculous scores with submachine guns. So they're rolling like well, I shouldn't say ridiculous, because you can roll like 30-something dice at first level after character creation if you really want to min-max your character. So these guys are rolling like, I think it was probably close to like 9 or 10, maybe as high as 12 for like the sergeant or something like that, and they shoot immediately because there's been enough time to decide like this corporation doesn't really care about its employees as much as it cares about its data, because its obligations to other companies are greater than its own employees. And one of them shoots, and he hits, I believe it was the street samurai, and they roll to try to soak the damage, and their armor isn't good enough, and their soak isn't good enough, they roll poorly, and they die. They just immediately die. Like a guy just basically booted it, like just ran out of an elevator with an MP5 and just raked them with bullets, and they're dead. And this kind of put the whole adventure at that point into like really high gear, because lethality in a lot of newer games, especially in newer fantasy games, is not very high, and this is a gigantic problem. Even when we played like Pathfinder and stuff before, you had to be playing pretty stupid to just die. But if you played, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons or Basic or something, dying is normal to you. But I don't think that just being cut down immediately had ever happened to any of these players before. So he's just dead, and me and him are just both laughing. Like we were playing online at the time, but just massive amounts of riotous laughter kind of like fill both sides of the microphone, or fill the air of our conversation, or what have you. Not both sides of the microphone, but we're both laughing in the mic because he's just immediately dead. The other two end up having this shootout with these two guards, and they win, but only barely. And I think it's at that point they realize how much trouble they're going to be in if they have a building that is full of these super badass guards. Because I think that they were expecting something more like Dungeons & Dragons, where you go and you can fight like 4 goblins or something. You can't really do that in Shadowrun unless you have a very, very exceptional mastery of the system. So now you're stuck with a face and a rigger. And they don't know where this thing they're supposed to be getting is, and they can't really find it at this point. And if they had a decker or someone with like a lot of computer skill, they would have been able to figure out where in the building this extra hard drive is. But at this point, they just had no one, right? So they're just madly running around. Eventually, they make it to the top of this other building without really running into too much security. And they figure out that the hard drive is in this cage, right? This fenced-off area where you'd have to have a key to get in, and there's just banks and banks of data storage. But there's an access computer where they can get into the system. And I think the face had some kind of computer skill or something. So he figures out what the password is, something like that, and he wants to unlock the drives, kind of eject them from their slots. Messes up his computer's check. All of the hard drives that are in there, like 3.5-inch drives, just pop out, and now they're all sort of piled on the floor. So they're madly searching through all of these hard drives because they can only like fit the drone in to try and figure out which one is supposed to be theirs, if it has any markings on it. Fortunately, they were all numbered, but they were all in like this jumbled mess on the ground. They're rolling to see how much time it's going to take. At the same time, the face has a radio. He set it to be like a police scanner or something like that. And they start to pick up signals that there is some sort of like special task force on the way. And I think they started to get like really scared at this point. Because if the guards were already this badass when they caught them by surprise, how good would like the special forces or something be? And there's this thing in Cyberpunk, which is called the Cyber Psycho Squad, where when people go insane because they've put so many augments on themselves that they kind of like take over the person's brain, they start to kill indiscriminately or just kind of go psychotic. You send in this cyber psycho squad of other people who are just as ogged up, pretty much, to go and kill them. And I kind of stole this idea and adapted it for Shadowrun. I know that a lot of other dungeon masters have done that as well. I actually think that there might be some other long-form kind of video, maybe one of the Noah Antweiler Spoonie videos, where he says pretty much the same thing. It's a very common idea to take this. And so they know that this task force, something is on the way, and they're super scared, and they're going through all of these hard drives. And I'll get back to my point about why the Matrix is important, because it seems kind of relevant now. So if you have a decker, what happens is, if you played Dystopia, for example, this person can kind of stick or Johnny Mnemonic, the movie or the book, they can plug something into their head, and they can plug it into what's called a cyber deck, or they can just go directly into a computer, and they can project a portion of themselves into the virtual realm and move around in three-dimensional space. And this is very good for finding the exact locations of things on a data system or a computer or what have you, because now you can navigate as if you would your normal real life. And this is a mechanic of Shadowrun that is unique and really good, but it slows down the game a lot. So I was glad that they didn't have a decker now, because things happen at kind of this ultimate super light speed. It's thought and light, so they get a lot more turns than everyone else, and it kind of sucks. But if they had a decker, they could have kind of skimmed through the system much better than they did. But unfortunately, they didn't have that. Fortunately for them, the corporate security didn't have time to call in any of the mages, because there is also a magic system as well. Mages are ungodly powerful. But they ran into guys with machine guns. There were probably more guys with machine guns on the way. They eventually get this hard drive. They find it. And they're trying to kind of retrace their steps out of the building, because they know that path is safe, when the building starts getting hit with like rocket launchers. And they need to have some sort of a way to escape. This is good, because in Shadowrun there's a lot of different services that you can hire, and they're contacting their handler. Whatever data that they have is worth so much money to this Johnson who has called them that they can call in for some sort of insane pilot who is willing to do some kind of like crazy hot extraction from the roof. So they end up in this situation where they have to hold off, right, until the helicopter can get close enough to extract them, at which point they'd have to get to the roof probably. But they're holding off against the security. They know that these special forces guys are infiltrating through some kind of means, and they're hoping not to run into them, and they keep rolling really, really well in order to not have these guys arrive. Like the Cyber Psycho Squad is taking the wrong detours in the sewer, and there was a hit team that was going to come in from the roof, but their helicopter is delayed because it needed to be refueled, and all kinds of things are happening behind the DM screen, which they don't know, which is good. And so they're actually doing really well at this point. They've kind of figured out the combats. One of them was rocking the Ares Predator, I think, which is like a big like hand cannon pistol. I think the other guy had like a submachine gun that he wasn't very good with. And the cops are threatening to show up at this point because the security's notified the police, who aren't as badass as private security, but because of how good all these augments and stuff are, they do have some agents that know what they're doing. And they're trying to do some kind of a hostage negotiation, at which point the face, who very, very intelligently purchased like rubber bullets, is like shooting people with rubber bullets to knock them unconscious, and it's doing stun damage. And these are just civilians, so they're screaming, thinking that people are being like executed in the conference room. The police really can't go in because whenever they move, these guys are pretending to execute somebody. Not that it really would have mattered if they did, but at least they're trying to be kind of moral about it. These people are relatively innocent. So are the security that they killed, but they shot first. So this helicopter eventually makes it onto the scene. And the pilot that I sort of just rolled up for them on the spot had limited piloting skills, but he ended up rolling something ridiculous, like 3 6s, and you can re-roll the 6s. And he got some insane number of successes, like 5 over what I was expecting. And they end up being able to get away from this first encounter with their lives. And they afterwards, everyone was kind of shocked that this is like such an extremely cool game that people don't really play so much. And so that's sort of the intro part of the story, I guess, where that's sort of how I would structure a Shadowrun game. But we'll talk some other aspects of the game that I think are interesting. When you are normally playing a Shadowrun game, it actually ends up playing a lot more like a BXD&D game, in the sense that it is very kind of sandbox based. So you can feel free to take that idea for the starter dungeon pretty much wholesale to introduce players to something like Shadowrun 3 or Shadowrun 5. And I think that would be a very good introduction to the mechanics, because they're going to get to use their skills. There's an area where they have a lot of computers. A mage would be good as well, because they can kind of see like astral ghosts of people through walls or through ceilings or what have you, if they're setted correctly. The adepts, which are kind of something between a mage and a street samurai, also would be useful there. And then obviously like the straight up enforcer classes, and everyone's going to be very useful. So you can take that as an example to jump from when you're introducing your friends to something like Shadowrun 3. But when you actually play, don't fall into the trap of playing a very linear style. There's only one thing that you can be doing, because the world of Shadowrun is extremely rich. You should be kind of running it how you would almost like an open world video game, or an open world, or ideally a very open world style of old school TTRPG play. What ended up happening after that is one of my friends really liked to DM, who was playing the face of that last game, took over, and I kind of gave him a few loose pointers, but he's a pretty good player, so he understood that you're supposed to give your players a lot of choice. So pick some sort of a location when you're setting up your Shadowrun game that exists in our world, because pretty much everywhere that exists in our reality ends up still existing after the magical awakening in Shadowrun. So a city that you live in the United States, or that you've been to, would be a really good example. Or we were playing in Montreal, which is a city in Quebec in Canada. And you can use the street maps from the city, from Google Maps or what have you, to create a very accurate Shadowrun setting. And there's analogs for all sorts of different businesses that can be there. A lot of chain restaurants and stuff you'd imagine would still exist in a couple years. Technology companies might come and go, but you know, the people who bought up parts of Google would still probably be around. So when you see like an Apple store, right, there might still be a computer shop there, and it's very easy to sort of populate a world map for Shadowrun, because it's just a slightly different version of our reality, honestly. Despite all of its fantastical aspects, they still have cars, and they're on streets and stuff like that. So that's very it's very easy to run a game like that. And there's so many Johnsons that want the work of Shadowrunners that you can sort of offer people multiple different jobs, and those jobs will progress into bigger and bigger jobs as they earn the trust of different organizations. Johnsons generally give sort of one really, really gigantic task and then kind of disappear. Like that one Johnson probably only has one job for you that's so big and so hot that they kind of have to back off for a while after that. But gangs and private investigators, stuff like that, they could just go up to Shadowrunners and ask them for their services normally. So you can actually develop relationships with these different people. Because it's a very free-form kind of game, and there's so much work to do, and so many different things that you can roll, having an actual lifestyle is very important in Shadowrun. In the pages of this book, you can actually roll up your character's entire lifestyle, like the level of food that they like to eat. Streets are ordered in an A to F tier, I think. They're an alphabetical system. So if you live in like B streets, it's like upper middle class, and so on. A Streets is very good, or it might have a slightly different name, but A Streets is good. And if you go farther down, like C Streets, D Streets, you're going to get the potential for people to break into your house. Maybe other Shadowrunners are on your trail, and they go to try and find your computer that you have at your shitty apartment because you're trying to lay low, and they break in and they steal your shit. So those are sorts of things that you might want to consider after you finish a starter dungeon to continue running the game. And if you set up a starter dungeon like this, unlike something like Pathfinder, 5th edition, or even other versions of Dungeons & Dragons that have come out since WizKids bought it, obviously. Not WizKids, sorry, Wizards of the Coast purchased Dungeons & Dragons. You will end up with a situation where your starting dungeon can actually evolve very organically into an entire campaign. Like what we ended up playing with that starter dungeon ended up just being a one-shot. Someone else took over DMing after. But that game very easily, because there's still a handler and they have established characters, that handler could just hire that one player that died, could just roll up another character and become part of the party again. And they could go on a different job or something like that, because we already have this world established. And the rest of the world is still happening. So after that job, maybe some sort of a major event occurs elsewhere in the world. And there are planes and there's international travel, and you can go there to go be a Shadowrunner after some sort of like paramilitary accident in the Middle East or something like that. And there's all kinds of different rules for it. So I'll try not to keep rambling on, because I know that these videos are very long, and I'm probably having a hard time staying on one subject. But what I'm trying to say is that if you're really stuck in this mindset of playing a lot of fantasy games and you want to play something that's very different from normal fantasy games, well, it still has some of the fantastical aspects like meta-human races like trolls and orcs and things, you really should look into picking up a copy of Shadowrun, ideally one of the first 3 editions, failing that, 5th edition. It will be a refreshing breath of fresh air for everybody in your party. You'll absolutely love it if you can decipher the really poorly laid out rules flipping between pages all the time. It's just a phenomenal game that will probably change the way that you play a lot of RPGs. It'll probably take over, at least for a time, from something like 5th edition or Pathfinder. And in doing so, there's a lot of very important skills that you can learn, such as actually making your own monsters and adversaries, teaching people very complicated systems, which maybe would let you play a more advanced RPG in the future, even if you go back to playing normal fantasy kinds of games. And because there are so many really, really great modules for it, and because it's had such little popularity, even compared to something like Cyberpunk, which is now becoming even more popular, because there's going to be that game coming out from CD Projekt, you will have this wealth of material that you are doing a disservice to yourself by not checking out if you think that you're a big fan of tabletop RPGs. So I won't ramble on any further. In conclusion, Shadowrun's a fantastic game. I'm sure I'm going to be talking about it again. And I hope that at least something that I've said in this video, even if you hate it, has made you want to go and look into this fantastic game, potentially introduce new players to it. And if you are introducing new players, use some of the ideas that I've just presented, or maybe ignore them entirely if you think that it sucks. But get more people into the game, playing correctly, and enjoying themselves. You owe it to yourself to check out Shadowrun.